The morning Irene Castellano signed the divorce papers, the sky outside the attorney's office was doing nothing in particular. It was not raining. It was not sunny. It was the flat, non-committal gray of a February sky in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania that had decided the day did not warrant weather and was simply providing coverage without comment. She noticed this afterward, standing on the sidewalk with her copy of the documents in a manila envelope, and the particular quality of silence that arrives when something very loud has finally stopped. She was 61 years old. She had been married to Dennis Castellano for 33 years, which meant she had been his wife since she was 28, which meant the entirety of the life she had built as an adult, the career she had paused and redirected and partially surrendered, the house she had painted and planted and tended, the children she had raised with the full weight of her attention and her love. All of it had been organized around the fact of their partnership. And now the partnership had a date on it. A final date. The kind that lawyers write in the lower right corner of documents and notarize with a stamp. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she walked to her car. The car was not hers. It was a 2009 Honda Civic that belonged to her sister Rosa, borrowed for the day, because the 2018 Subaru that Irene had driven for 4 years was now, along with a number of other things, subject to the terms of the agreement she was carrying in the manila envelope. She had not argued about the car. She had not argued about most of the things that were now no longer hers. Her attorney, a measured woman named Patricia, who had handled the case with the careful efficiency of someone who has learned not to absorb her client's grief as her own, had told her she was leaving things on the table. Irene had said she understood that. Patricia had said she wanted to make sure Irene understood it fully. Irene had said she did. She drove back to Rosa's house in Mechanicsburg, where she had been living for 5 months. Rosa had made coffee. She was that kind of woman, a woman who understood that coffee was not coffee in circumstances like these, but was the warm, physical evidence of someone who was still present and still paying attention, and she put a cup in front of Irene without asking and sat down across from her with her own cup and said nothing, which was the correct thing to say. They sat like that for a while. Irene said, "Eventually, it is done." Rosa said, "Yes." Then the silence again. The specific silence of two sisters who have been talking to each other for 60 years and have no need to fill the space between words when the words are not yet ready. It had started the way these things often start, not with a single event, but with the slow accumulation of events that each seemed manageable on their own and were not manageable in aggregate. Dennis had been a good man in the ways that are visible and a deficient man in the ways that are not, which is a combination that takes years to accurately diagnose, because the visible goodness keeps creating doubt about what you are beginning to understand. He had worked hard. He had been present. He had coached their son Marco's baseball teams for 6 years and had remembered the names of all the other children on those teams, which was the kind of thing people point to when they're explaining why someone was a good father. And he had been, in certain ways and in certain seasons, a good father. He had also, over a period of years that Irene would later understand to have begun much earlier than she had recognized, been siphoning the life out of their marriage in ways that were not visible until they were irreversible. The money had been the clearest part. The savings account that was supposed to represent 30 years of careful accumulation, and that had been, she discovered in the accounting that divorce proceedings require, significantly less full than it should have been. The retirement funds redirected through a series of transactions that her attorney had traced with the focused attention of someone following a thread through a maze, transactions that she had not known about, that she had trusted she did not need to know about, that she had left to Dennis because Dennis was organized about money and she was organized about other things. And this division of labor had seemed, for 30 years, to be working. Their daughter Sophia had been 26 when Irene found out. Their son Marco had been 29. They had not been children who needed protection from adult information. They had been adults who were confronted with it. And they had, in the way of adult children who have built their understanding of the world on a specific foundation, needed time to adjust. Sophia had adjusted in her father's direction. Marco had adjusted in a way that was harder to characterize, a kind of stunned neutrality that Irene understood was grief rather than indifference, and that she had tried to honor without pushing at. She did not blame her children. She had decided this very early and had held to it with the same consistency she brought to things she decided were important. Sophia and Marco had not done anything to her. Dennis had done things to her, and her children had responded to those things in the ways they were capable of responding, and her job was not to hold their responses against them, but to love them in whatever distance they created. This was easier to believe than to practice. She practiced it anyway. The house had been the last thing. The house on Garfield Avenue in Harrisburg where they had lived for 22 years, where she had painted every room herself over the course of 4 summers. Where the kitchen had the backsplash, she had spent 3 weekends laying in a pattern she had drawn herself on graph paper. Where the garden in the back had taken 10 years. To become what it was, layered and seasonal and entirely hers in a way that a garden that you have built from bare ground is yours. The house had gone to Dennis as part of the settlement. Patricia had told her it did not have to. Irene had said she understood that. She had stopped being able to look at the garden without feeling the weight of it. Some things become too heavy with memory to carry, and the correct response is not to carry them. So she had let it go. She had let the house go and the car and the savings that remained in the life she had organized, and she had moved into Rosa's spare bedroom with a suitcase and 2 boxes and the slow understanding that 61 is not an ending unless you decide it is. She was not sure yet what she decided. If you're watching this and thinking that 61 is too old to begin again, stay with this story. Because what Irene found waiting for her was something that had been waiting for exactly this long, and it could not have found her a single day sooner. She had been at Rosa's house for 5 months when the letter arrived. It came in the regular mail, a business envelope with a return address that said Kessler and Boyle, attorneys at law, Dunmore, Pennsylvania. She had no business with any attorney in Dunmore. She had no connection to Dunmore at all, a small city in the northeastern corner of the state that she had passed through once or twice on drives, and had no particular relationship with beyond its existence on the map. She opened it at Rosa's kitchen table with her coffee. The letter was from an attorney named Gerald Boyle, and it concerned the estate of her grandmother, Concetta Maria Valesio, who had died in November at the age of 94. This information was not new. Irene had known her grandmother was gone. She had driven to Dunmore for the funeral, had sat in the church where her grandmother had worshipped for 70 years, had stood at the graveside with the other members of the family, and felt the specific grief of losing someone very old who had been, in the way of very old people who have been paying attention, the person in the family who saw you most accurately. She had not expected the letter. Nonna Concetta had been, as Irene understood it, a woman of modest means. The daughter of Italian immigrants who had come to northeastern Pennsylvania in the 1920s to work the coal mines. A woman who had raised 4 children on a miner's wages after her husband died young, who had kept the family together through the kind of consistent effort that does not make for dramatic stories, but makes for children who grow up with something solid under their feet. Irene had loved her grandmother with the specific love that you feel for people who see you clearly and ask nothing in return for the seeing. And she had assumed, in the way you assume things about people whose lives appear to be circumscribed by the ordinary, that there was nothing extraordinary in what Nonna Concetta would leave behind. The letter said otherwise. The estate, Gerald Boyle wrote, included the residential property at 14 Valesio Road, Dunmore, Pennsylvania, which Concetta Valesio had inherited from her father, Emilio Valesio, in 1961, and which had been in the family since 1924. The property had been left, specifically and exclusively, to Irene, not to any of the other grandchildren. Not to Irene's mother or her aunts. To Irene alone. The will was explicit. It named her by her full name, Irene Maria Castellano ne Valesio, with the particular specificity of a document written by someone who does not want ambiguity about their intentions. There was more. Gerald Boyle wrote that the property had not been occupied since 1987. There was a reason for this, which he would explain in person. He asked that she come to his office at her earliest convenience. Irene read the letter twice. Then she called Rosa into the kitchen and handed it to her without comment. Rosa read it. She looked up. She said, "Did you know about this house?" Irene said, "I knew she had a house. I did not know it had been empty for 37 years. Rosa said, "Why was it empty?" Irene said, "I suppose that is what I'm going to find out." She drove to Dunmore 2 days later, alone, because this was the kind of thing you do alone, a gray Tuesday in February on the highway through the valley with the mountains on either side, and the particular quality of late winter light in northeastern Pennsylvania that is not beautiful exactly, but is specific, the light of a place that knows its own character and does not try to be other than it is. Gerald Boyle's office was on Main Street, a second-floor walk-up above a tax preparation service, the kind of small law practice that handles the ordinary legal business of a small city's residents, estates and property transfers, and the documents that accumulate around an ordinary life. Gerald Boyle was 70 himself, a compact man with reading glasses on a chain and the careful manner of someone who has spent 40 years listening to people in difficult circumstances and has developed, in consequence, a specific kind of patience. He offered her coffee. She accepted. He poured 2 cups from a machine on the credenza and sat down across from her and set the file on the desk between them. He said, "I want to tell you about the property before we discuss the legal details, because the legal details will make more sense if you understand a history." She said, "Please." The Valesio family had come to Dunmore in 1924. Emilio Valesio, her great-grandfather, had come with his wife Lucia and their 3 young children from a village in the Abruzzo region of central Italy, following the wave of immigration that had brought thousands of Italians to the coal mining communities of Pennsylvania in the early decades of the century. Emilio had worked the mines for 6 years, the dangerous, particular work of men who spend their days underground extracting what the earth holds, and had survived the work and the conditions and the accidents that did not kill him, though they killed others, and had in 1930 taken the savings of those 6 years and purchased a property on the eastern edge of Dunmore. The property was a house and a piece of ground. The house was old even then, an 1890s construction in the vernacular style of the region, 2 stories, stone foundation, the kind of house that was built to last by people who expected to last in it. The ground was a half-acre lot that ran back from the road to a stone wall at the rear, with a mature apple orchard that had been established sometime in the previous century and that Lucia Valesio had tended with the focused attention of someone who understands that fruit trees require years before they produce, and that the tending is an act of faith in continuity. Emilio Valesio had also, in 1930, built a cellar. Not the cellar that was standard beneath the house, which existed and was practical and housed the furnace and the preserves and the coal that heated the rooms above. A second cellar, a separate structure, stone-walled and stone-roofed, built into the ground on the north side of the property near the rear wall, with a door of iron-reinforced oak that he had constructed himself over the course of a winter, a door that was, when Gerald Boyle described it, not the casual construction of a man building storage space, but the deliberate work of someone building something intended to endure. Irene said, "What was it for?" Gerald Boyle said, "That is the part of the story I can only tell you partially. What I know is what your grandmother told me when she retained me to handle her estate 6 years ago, which is to say she told me the history as she understood it, and she was a woman who was careful about the distinction between what she knew and what she supposed." He folded his hands on the desk. What Emilio Valesio had put in that cellar, Gerald Boyle said, was the family's most valuable possessions. Not valuable in the general sense. Valuable in the specific sense of things that a family moving from one country to another in a time of considerable global uncertainty would have brought with them and would have wished to preserve beyond any ordinary risk. Documents, papers, certain objects, and other things that Nonna Concetta had described to Gerald Boyle with the particular obliqueness of someone communicating the fact of a thing's existence without communicating its nature, because she had not entered the cellar herself and did not know with certainty what remained. The cellar had been sealed in 1987. Irene said, "Sealed how?" Gerald Boyle said, "Your grandmother's husband, your grandfather Aldo Valesio, died in 1985. After his death, your grandmother inherited the property. In 1987, she made a decision, which she described to me as a decision she made deliberately and which she declined to explain further, to lock the cellar and not re-enter it. She kept the key. She gave it to me for safekeeping when she retained me to handle the estate. And she specified in the will that the property and the key were to go to you." He opened the file. He took out a key. It was iron, old iron, the kind of key that a man might have made himself or had made specifically, heavy in proportion to its size and dark with the patina of many decades of existence. It was not beautiful. It was not decorative. It was functional in the precise way of things made to perform a single purpose by someone who understood that the purpose was serious. He sat on the desk between them. She looked at it. She did not touch it yet. She said, "Did she say why she chose me?" Gerald Boyle said, "She said you were the one who would understand what to do with it." He paused. He was a careful man and chose his pauses carefully. He said, "She also said that she had been watching you for years, the way grandmothers watch, and that she believed you were the person in the family with the correct combination of patience and stubbornness and love of old things to do what needed to be done." Those were her words. Patience and stubbornness and love of old things. Irene looked at the key on the desk. She thought about Nonna Concetta, who had been 94 years old and had lived the last 7 years of her life in a room at her daughter's house in Scranton. A room with a window that looked onto the street and a rosary on the bedside table, and the particular stillness of someone who has finished the active portion of their life and is engaged in the quieter work of completion. She thought about the last time she had sat with her grandmother, the previous spring, a Sunday afternoon in April with the window open and the sound of the street below, and Nonna Concetta's hand in hers, dry and weightless, a hand that had worked hard for 9 decades and was now simply resting. Nonna Concetta had said, that afternoon, without apparent context, "You are going to be all right, Irene." Irene had said she hoped so. Nonna Concetta had said, "I know so." There's a difference. She had not asked what her grandmother meant. She had assumed it was the kind of reassurance that very old people offer, the accumulated wisdom of a long life expressed as confidence in the young, and she had accepted it in the spirit in which it seemed to be given. She understood now that it had been something more specific. She picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. She drove to 14 Valesio Road after leaving Gerald Boyle's office. The address was on the eastern edge of Dunmore, off the main road, down a street that narrowed as it proceeded, the houses getting older and further apart, the lots larger, the sense of the neighborhood shifting from the ordinary residential to something with more history in it. The kind of street that had been built when space was less contested and when the relationship between a house and its ground was understood differently. The property was at the end of the street. She stopped the car and looked at it through the windshield for a moment before getting out. The house was 2 stories, stone foundation as Gerald Boyle had said, the upper portion in with siding that had been painted at some point in the previous century and not painted since. The paint now a pale, weathered gray that was not quite any color. The roof showed its age but appeared intact. The windows were shuttered, the shutters latched from outside. The porch across the front was solid but unpainted, the boards dark with weather and years. The property around the house was what 37 years of untended growth produces, not the dramatic wilderness of outright abandonment, but the specific overgrowth of a place that has been neither cultivated nor cleared, the apple trees visible at the rear of the lot grown to their full unpruned size, their winter branches reaching in the directions they had chosen without anyone to guide them. The grass of the front yard was the compressed, matted growth of many seasons layered on each other. A rose bush beside the front steps had grown over the porch railing and down the other side and had, in its decades of unguided ambition, become something architectural. She got out of the car. The air was cold and still and had the particular quality of late winter in the mountains, clean and sharp, the smell of stone and old wood and the mineral edge of snow that was nearby but not yet present. She walked to the front of the property and stood at the gate. The gate was iron, old iron like the key, a simple design, a horizontal bar between 2 uprights set in a stone post that had been there since before she was born. It was not locked. She lifted the latch, and it opened, the hinges stiff but functional, and she walked up the path to the porch. She stood on the porch and looked at the front door. It was a substantial door, wood-paneled, with a brass plate around the keyhole that had gone green with decades of weather. The lock was below the plate, an old lock, the kind that the key in her pocket had been made for. She did not go in yet. She walked around the house first, the way you walk around something you're trying to understand, moving along the stone foundation, noting where the mortar had been repaired and where it had not, where the siding was weathered beyond the cosmetic, and where it was simply old. She walked to the rear of the property and stood among the apple trees, 10 of them, arranged in 2 rows that Valesio had planted in 1930 and that had been growing in their unpruned freedom for decades. They were large trees, their trunks the girth of things that have had a century to become what they are, their branch structures complex and tangled and full of the small signs of life that old trees carry even in February. The buds forming under their winter casings, the bark moving almost imperceptibly in the cold air. She stood among them for a while. Then she looked to the north side of the property. The cellar door was not immediately visible. It was set into the ground at an angle, the way of old storm cellar doors, 2 iron-bound wooden panels meeting at a central seam, set into a stone surround that had been built flush with the surface of the ground and that had been covered over the decades with the same mat of dead grass and old leaves that covered the rest of the property. She would not have found it without knowing to look, but she knew to look. She crossed to it and crouched and cleared the debris from the surface with her hands, the cold leaves and the wet grass coming away to reveal the wood of the door beneath, dark with age and moisture but solid, the iron bindings still intact, the hasp still present, and locked with a padlock that was old iron, the same material as the key, the same quality of construction. She looked at the padlock. She looked at the key in her hand. She did not open it yet. She was not ready yet, and she understood this about herself, that readiness was a real thing and not a performance of caution, that there were moments in life that required the full weight of your attention, and that trying to rush them was a form of disrespect to what they were. She stood up. She looked at the house. She looked at the apple trees. She looked at the sky above Dunmore, which was still doing nothing in particular, still the flat gray of February that had not yet decided to become anything else. She thought about Nonna Concetta saying, "I know so. There is a difference." She thought about a woman who had locked a cellar door in 1987 and kept the key for 37 years and given it to her granddaughter at the end of her life with a specific confidence that the granddaughter would know what to do. She thought about the manila envelope on Rose's kitchen counter with the divorce papers inside. She thought about the house on Garfield Avenue with the backsplash she had laid herself and the garden she had spent 10 years building. She thought about Dennis signing the documents across from her in Patricia's conference room without looking at her face. She thought, "I have nothing left to lose." She thought, "I have everything left to find." She walked back to the car. She drove to Rose's house. She ate dinner and called Gerald Boyle the following morning and told him she intended to take possession of the property, and he said he would prepare the transfer documents, and she said she would be back on Friday to sign them. Then she told Rosa. Rosa said, "You're going to move to Dunmore?" Irene said, "I'm going to go see what my grandmother left me." Rosa said, "Irene, the house has been empty for 37 years. Irene said, "I know." Rosa said, "You're 61 years old." Irene said, "I know that too." Rosa looked at her across the dinner table with the specific look of a younger sister who has watched an older sister make decisions for 60 years and has learned to distinguish between the decisions that are reckless and the decisions that only appear reckless from the outside because the person making them knows something that is not visible from where Rosa is sitting. She said, "When do you leave?" Irene said, "As soon as the papers are signed." She signed the papers on Friday. She loaded her suitcase and her 2 boxes into Rosa's Civic, which Rosa lent her without being asked, in the way Rosa did things, and she drove northeast on a Saturday morning in late February through the valley with the mountains on both sides and arrived in Dunmore in the early afternoon under a sky that had finally decided to do something and was producing a thin, purposeful snow. She had called ahead to a hardware store on Main Street and had arranged to pick up cleaning supplies and basic provisions. She had called the utility company and restarted the electric service. She had called a plumber recommended by Gerald Boyle's secretary, and he had agreed to come the following Monday to assess the water and heating situation. She was not going in unprepared. She was going in without the full picture, which is not the same thing. She parked in front of 14 Valesio Road and sat for a moment. The house looked the same as it had on Tuesday. Of course it did. Houses do not change in response to your decisions about them. They simply wait. She got out of the car. She carried her suitcase and the cleaning supplies to the front porch. She took the key from her coat pocket and she looked at it once, and then she put in the lock. The lock turned. The door opened. The smell came the way it always does in places that have been closed for a long time. Not of damage, not of rot, but of stopped time, the compressed air of a space that has been holding its breath, wood and plaster, and the ghost of every fire and every meal and every season that had passed through these rooms before the door was shut. She stood in the doorway. The entrance hall was dim, the shuttered windows admitting only thin lines of the winter afternoon. But she could see. The floor was wide plank wood, dark with age and covered in a uniform layer of dust. A staircase ran up the left side, its banister intact. A coat rack on the wall to the right held 2 coats, dark wool, the coats of people who had expected to return. She stepped inside. She set her suitcase down. She was 61 years old, and she was standing in her great-grandfather's house, and the key to the cellar was in her pocket, and she was not going to open that cellar today, because today was for understanding what she had walked into and for making a fire in the fireplace she could see in the room to the left and for making the space livable enough for the night. The cellar had waited 37 years. It could wait one more day. She took off her coat. She hung it on the coat rack beside the 2 coats that had been waiting. She found a flashlight in the cleaning supplies she had brought. She began to move through the house. If you've been watching since the beginning of this story, you already understand that what Irene walked into was not simply a house. It was a question that her grandmother had spent 37 years deciding she was not the right person to answer, and that she had saved with the patience of someone who understands that the right answer requires the right person, for the granddaughter she believed was ready. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Irene found in the rooms of the house was not what she expected, which was emptiness, the neutral vacancy of a space that had been cleared before it was closed. What she found instead was a household interrupted, not abandoned in the way of people who have left in haste or in hardship, but interrupted in the specific way of a space that has been closed deliberately and carefully, the way you close something you intend to reopen and which events have prevented you from reopening for longer than you planned. The furniture was present. Not all of it. Some rooms held only the larger pieces, but present. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, solid wood, the kind of table that is built to last generations. A sideboard in the dining room with its surface cleared, but its drawers still holding the accumulated small objects of domestic life. A collection of linens, a set of silver-plated utensils wrapped in the flannel cloth that prevents tarnish, 2 candlesticks in brass that had gone green, but retained their form entirely. A clock on the kitchen wall stopped, its hands pointing to 20 minutes past 3 on a day that was now 37 years gone. In the second bedroom upstairs, a dressing table with a mirror, and on the dressing table, arranged with the deliberate care of someone tidying a space they will not return to, a set of objects. A small photograph in a frame. A glass bottle of perfume, empty, its stopper still in place. A rosary of dark red beads. And beside the rosary, on a folded piece of cloth, a small iron key. Not the key she carried. A different key. Smaller, older, the iron worn smooth in a way that suggested it had been handled many times over many years. The bow of the key formed in a simple oval, the bit cut in a pattern she did not recognize. She picked it up. She held it in the same hand as the key Gerald Boyle had given her. 2 keys. The house that appeared to be empty was not empty. The house was full of things that had been waiting. And in the ground outside, behind the stone wall, beneath the iron-bound wooden door that she had found and not yet opened, was whatever her grandmother had been keeping for 37 years. She set the small key carefully in her coat pocket beside the larger one. She made a fire in the parlor fireplace, working through it methodically the way she worked through everything, without rushing, understanding that fire requires patience, and that patience is not hesitation, but the correct application of attention. The fire caught on the second attempt. The wood was old and dry, and caught with the particular willingness of things that have been waiting to be useful. She sat in front of the fire in the one armchair that remained in the parlor, a wing chair in dark fabric that had faded to an indeterminate color, but held its shape entirely. And she looked at the room around her, and the 2 keys in her hand, and the snow that had thickened outside the shuttered windows, and she felt something that she had not felt in 5 months. Not since before the divorce papers, and not since before the accounting of the savings, and not since before a great deal of things that had taken the ground out from under her feet. She felt that she was in the right place. Not that everything was all right. Everything was not all right. She was 61 years old, and she was sitting alone in an unheated house in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, with $30 in her checking account and a suitcase with 3 changes of clothes and 2 boxes with everything else she owned, and a man she had spent 33 years with had just signed the papers that said they were done. No, that was all right, but she was in the right place. There is a difference between those two things, and she was beginning to understand it. Outside, the snow was falling on the apple trees and on the stone wall at the rear of the property and on the iron-bound door set in the ground on the north side. The door that held what Emilio Valesio had sealed in 1930 and what Concetta Valesio had resealed in 1987 and what no one had opened since. And the snow covered it evenly with the patient indifference of weather that does not know what it is covering and does not need to know. The fire burned steadily. The 2 keys rested in her palm. She closed her fingers around them and held them and let the warmth of the fire begin to move through the room, and she did not think about Dennis, and she did not think about the house on Garfield Avenue, and she did not think about Sophia, who had gone to her father's side, and Marco, who had gone to a careful neutrality that was its own kind of distance. She thought about Nonna Concetta's hand in hers on that Sunday in April. She thought about, I know so. There is a difference. She thought tomorrow. Tomorrow she would open the door. She was ready. She did not open it in the morning. The morning came in gray and cold through the gaps in the shutters, and she woke in the wing chair where she had fallen asleep. The fire burned down to ash, the 2 keys still in her hand. Her back told her something about sleeping in chairs that she already knew. She sat for a moment in the particular stillness of a house that is quiet in a way that city houses are never quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different kind of silence. The silence of a place that has been holding itself together for a long time, without anyone to witness it. She made coffee on a small camp stove she had brought in the provisions from Main Street, boiling the water in a saucepan and filtering it through the paper filter she had thought to pack, and she drank it standing in the kitchen looking at the stop clock on the wall. 20 minutes past 3 on a day in 1987. She had been 24 years old in 1987. She had been in her first apartment in Harrisburg, working as a bookkeeper for a tile company, not yet married to Dennis, not yet anything that she had subsequently become. The clock did not know any of this. She spent the morning on the house before the cellar. This was not delay, or she told herself it was not delay, though she understood that the distinction between preparation and delay is sometimes a fine one, and she was perhaps not the most objective judge of which side of it she was on. She opened the shutters on the ground floor, room by room, the latches stiff and protesting, and let the February light in. Gray light, flat light, but light. The house received it in the way of spaces that have been in the dark for a long time, not dramatically, but with the specific quality of something returning to its natural condition. She swept. She had brought a broom, and she swept the main floor from back to front, moving the dust of 37 years into the cold air outside the front door. And what the sweeping revealed was a floor of wide pine boards that were dark with age, but intact, that had the particular quality of old wood that has been well made and has lasted because it was made well. She ran her hand along the surface after she swept it and felt the grain of wood that had been growing before her grandmother was born. She examined the kitchen stove, a gas range from some time in the 1970s that had been left connected to the supply line. She did not try to light it yet. She had called the gas company the previous week, and they were coming Thursday to inspect and restore the service. She had a list, a practical list in the notebook she carried in her coat pocket, organized in the order that logic required: utilities first, then structure, then the interior, and the cellar at the end of the list, not because it was least important, but because it was most important, because the things most worth doing deserve the fullness of your attention and not the remainder of it. The plumber came Monday, as he had said he would, a man named Caruso, who was somewhere in his 50s, and who moved through the house with the efficient familiarity of someone who has been in many old houses and knows what he is looking for before he sees it. He restored the water, replaced 2 sections of supply pipe that had corroded past usefulness, confirmed that the hot water heater was functional once the gas was connected, and told her the overall condition of the plumbing was, given the years of dormancy, better than he had any right to expect. Irene said, "My great-grandfather built this house." Caruso said, "It shows." He did good work. He left her his card and told her to call if anything else turned up, and she thanked him and put the card in her notebook and went back to work. By Tuesday, she had the ground floor habitable. By Wednesday, she had moved from the wing chair to the bedroom at the front of the second floor, which held a bedstead of iron with a bare mattress that she covered with the blanket she had brought from Rose's house. And she slept in a bed for the first time in days and woke to the sound of a bird on the windowsill outside the shutter and lay still and listened to it for a while before she got up. On Thursday, the gas came back. On Thursday evening, she cooked a real meal on the kitchen stove for the first time, pasta with the Jared sauce she had bought at the grocery store on Main Street, standing at the kitchen counter eating it because the table had not yet been wiped down to her satisfaction, and the hot food in the cold kitchen felt like something being restored, the way a function feels when it has been absent long enough that its return is noticed. She opened the cellar on Friday morning. She woke early without an alarm and lay in the iron bed for a moment and understood that she had been ready since Tuesday and had been finishing the house because finishing the house was what needed to be done first and was now done, and that there was nothing remaining between her and the door in the ground except the walk across the backyard. She dressed. She made coffee. She put both keys in her coat pocket and she went outside. The February morning was clear, the first clear morning since she had arrived. The sky a pale, clean blue above the roofline of the house, and the apple trees standing in their winter complexity against it, their branches precise and dark. The snow from Saturday had melted by midweek, and the ground was firm, but not frozen, the particular consistency of late winter earth that is beginning below the surface to consider spring. She walked around the north side of the house to the cellar door. It looked the same as it had on Tuesday, when she had first found it and cleared the debris from its surface. Two wooden panels set at an angle into the ground, iron-bound, the hasp locked with the padlock of old iron. The stone surround was solid, no crumbling, no shift from the weight of the years above it. Emilio Valesio had built things to last, and they had lasted. She crouched and looked at the padlock. She took the larger key from her pocket, the key Gerald Boyle had kept for her grandmother for 6 years. The key Nonna Concetta had held for 37 years before that. She put in the padlock. It turned. Not easily, not without resistance. The mechanism protesting the movement with the specific reluctance of iron that has not moved in a long time. But it turned. All the way. The shackle released. She removed the padlock and set on the ground beside her, and she lifted the hasp, and she took hold of the iron handle set into the right-hand panel, and she pulled. The door opened. The smell rose before she could see anything, and it was not what she expected. She had expected the smell of damp and age and the particular darkness of things long sealed. What she got was something else entirely, cool and dry, the smell of stone and cedar and old paper, a smell that was preserved rather than decayed, the smell of something that had been closed carefully rather than abandoned. She had brought a flashlight. She turned it on and directed it into the opening. Stone steps descended, 6 of them, cut from the same stone as the surrounding foundation. At the bottom of the steps was a floor of fitted stone, dry, the cedar she had smelled in strips along the base of the walls, the old method of keeping moisture out of a space that needs to stay dry. The walls were stone and mortar, solid, no visible damage. The ceiling was low, perhaps 6 feet, stone as well. The room was perhaps 12 feet by 15. She went down the steps. She stood at the bottom and moved the flashlight slowly around the space. Along the left wall, shelving had been built, heavy timber shelves bolted into the stone, and on the shelves, arranged with the particular order of someone who has organized a space to be found rather than simply stored, were boxes. Not cardboard. Cardboard would not have survived. Wood boxes with fitted lids, small and medium, some wrapped in oilskin that had kept them sealed against the limited moisture that even the driest cellar holds over decades. On the right wall, hung on iron hooks set into the mortar, were tools. Old tools, the tools of someone who worked with his hands, and beside the tools in a flat wooden case What she could see even from across the room was a collection of something, objects organized in a case, their nature not yet visible. In the center of the room, on the stone floor, was a trunk. Not large, perhaps 3 feet long, 2 feet wide. Iron-bound wood, old iron, the same quality as the door above and the padlock she had removed. The trunk had a lock. The lock was smaller than the padlock above, a keyhole of the shape that the second key, the smaller key she had found on the dressing table upstairs, had been made for. She crossed the room to the trunk. She crouched before it. She did not open it yet. She looked around the cellar first, taking it in fully, understanding that this was a room that deserved to be understood before it was disturbed. She looked at the shelves and the boxes in their oilskin wrappings. She looked at the tools on the wall. She moved to the flat wooden case and held the flashlight over it, and saw what it held. Coins. Not a few. Many. Arranged in rows in the fitted case with the careful organization of someone who understands what they have and values it accordingly. Old coins, the flashlight showing the dull gold and silver of metals that had not seen light in decades. Coins of different sizes, some familiar in shape, some not. She could not read the denominations from where she stood. She did not touch them yet. She moved to the shelves. The wooden boxes were labeled, each one in the same hand, a careful hand, the handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship with seriousness, faded ink on small cards, attached to the boxes with wire. The labels were in Italian and in English both, side by side, as if the person writing them had been translating their life into the new language while preserving the original. Atti di Famiglia, family papers, corrispondenza, letters, photographi, photographs, and one label that was only in Italian, one word, promesse, promises. She stood in the cellar her great-grandfather had built in 1930, and she looked at the word, promesse, promises. She took the box labeled promesse from the shelf. It was lighter than she expected. She sat on the floor, and she sat on the stone floor beside it, her flashlight balanced on the edge of a shelf above, and she removed the oilskin wrapping with the care of someone handling something they understand to be significant. The box lid lifted without difficulty, the fitted wood moving cleanly. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had been silk once and was now the ghost of silk, was a bundle of papers, folded and tied with a ribbon of dark red. She untied the ribbon. She unfolded the papers. Her Italian was not fluent. It had never been fluent, the casualty of being 2 generations from immigration. The language that her grandmother's generation had spoken at home and her mother's generation had partially learned and her generation had received only in fragments, phrases and endearments, and the particular expressions that do not translate. But she could read enough. And what she could not read from the language, she could read from the form of the documents, the official stamps, the signatures, the particular format of legal instruments that does not change entirely between languages. They were deeds, property deeds, in the name of Emilio Valesio, and then in the name of his son Aldo, her grandfather, and then in a later document dated 1962, in the name of Concetta Valesio. Deeds to property in Dunmore, multiple properties, 3 of them, the descriptions in the legal language of their era, lot numbers and boundaries, and the particular geography of a city block in northeastern Pennsylvania. She read them twice, slowly, her finger moving under the words she did not know and guessing at them from context and from the words she did. 3 properties. This house was one of them. The other 2 were on streets in Dunmore she did not know. She folded the documents carefully along their original folds and set them on the floor beside her. She looked at the trunk. She took the small key from her pocket, the key from the dressing table upstairs, worn smooth with handling, the oval bow of it comfortable in her fingers. She put in the lock of the trunk. It turned easily, as if it had been turned recently, as if it had been waiting with more patience than was ordinary for a lock. The lid opened. Inside the trunk, nested in a wrapping of heavy wool that had kept them safe for longer than Irene had been alive, were objects that she could see clearly enough with the flashlight to understand they were old and were made with precision and were not ordinary. The first thing she lifted out was a box within the trunk, a small case of dark wood with a brass clasp, and when she opened the clasp and lifted the lid she found, resting in formed velvet, that had held their shape across the decades. A set of jewelry. Not costume jewelry. Not the modest decorative pieces that a woman of limited means might have owned. These were pieces of a different order. A necklace of gold links with a pendant of deep red stone that caught the flashlight and held it. Earrings to match. A brooch of worked gold in a floral pattern with stones of the same red that the pendant held. And a ring. A wide band of gold set with 5 stones in a row. The stones the color of the deep water. She looked at these pieces for a long time. She did not know what she was looking at, not with the precision that would give her their value or their history. She knew only that they were old and were made well and were not the things that a woman of her great-grandmother Lucia's circumstances would have acquired in Pennsylvania in the 1920s. These were things that had come from somewhere else, that had crossed the Atlantic in the same trunks that had brought the family from the Abruzzo, and had been placed in this cellar for safekeeping in 1930 and have been waiting in the dark ever since. She set the jewelry case carefully on the floor beside her. She lifted the next layer of wool from the trunk. Beneath, it was a flat package, again oilskin, again tied with ribbon, and when she unwrapped it, she found paintings. Not large, not framed, canvas rolled carefully and tied, and when she unrolled the first one in the beam of the flashlight, she saw a figure, a woman, painted with the kind of technical precision that belongs to a particular tradition of painting that she had seen in museums and in books, and that did not belong in a cellar in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, in a trunk her great-grandfather had sealed in 1930. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the painting in her hands. She looked at the cellar around her, at the shelves with their labeled boxes, at the tools on the wall, at the coin case, at the trunk open at her feet. She sat in the cellar for a long time. Then she climbed the stone steps back into the February morning and stood in the backyard of the house on Valesio Road and looked at the apple trees and the sky and breathed the cold air and thought about what she had just seen. She called Rosa. Rosa said, "How are you? How is the house?" Irene said, "I opened the cellar." Rosa was quiet. Irene said, "I need you to come. I need you to see this with me because I am not sure I am understanding what I am seeing correctly, and I need someone else's eyes." Rosa said, "I will come Saturday." Rosa came Saturday. She drove up from Mechanicsburg in the morning and arrived at noon and stood in the front yard of 14, Valesio Road, and looked at the house and said, "It is bigger than I expected." Irene said, "Come inside." She had not moved anything from the cellar. She had gone back down twice during the week, once on Friday morning and once on Friday evening, and she had looked at everything again, and she had not touched anything except to replace the lid on the jewelry case and re-roll the painting and set them back in the trunk exactly as she had found them, because she understood, with the instinct of someone who has spent her life being careful about things that matter, that what was in that cellar was not hers to disturb until she understood what it was. She had made one call during the week. She had called the library on Main Street, and she had asked the librarian, a woman named Dorothea, who had been helpful about the local history section, whether there was anyone in Dunmore who specialized in the assessment of old artwork and antiques. Dorothea had given her a name. She had not yet called the name. She was waiting for Rosa. She took Rosa down to the cellar that afternoon. Rosa stood at the bottom of the steps and moved the flashlight slowly and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Nonna knew what was down here?" Irene said, "She sealed it in 1987. She must have known." Rosa said, "Why did she seal it?" Irene said, "I have been thinking about this all week." She had been thinking about it all week, turning it the way you turn something you do not yet have the right grip on, trying different angles of approach to the question of why a woman would lock away things of evident value and keep them locked for 37 years, and then give the key to a granddaughter she trusted to know what to do. She had arrived at the beginning of an answer, which was not yet a full answer, but was the beginning of one. The beginning of the answer was that Nonna Concetta had sealed the cellar in 1987, which was 2 years after her husband Aldo had died, which meant she had sealed it in the period immediately following her husband's death, which meant the sealing was connected to the loss, which meant the decision had been emotional as well as practical, and that the emotional component was the one Irene needed to understand before the practical one would make sense. She said this to Rosa, standing in the cellar with a flashlight between them. Rosa said she was protecting it. Irene said, "From what?" Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the careful way of someone who is about to say something that matters from the family, from everyone who would have wanted a piece of it the moment they knew it existed. Irene looked at her sister. Rosa said, "You know I am right. You know what would have happened in 1987 if she had opened this cellar and shown everyone what was in it." Mama sighed alone. Irene knew. She thought about the family she had grown up in, large in particular, with its specific dynamics and its specific fault lines, and she thought about what the sight of a jewelry case with those stones and a rolled canvas of that quality would have produced in 1987 among a group of people none of whom had expected anything. Rosa said, "She chose you because you would not do that." Irene said, "I have nothing now. I could do very much with what is in this room." Rosa said, "That is not what I mean." Irene looked at her. Rosa said, "She chose you because you would understand that what is in this room is not about what you can do with it. She chose you because you were the one who would ask the right questions first. What is it? Where did it come from? What does it mean? And only then what do we do with it?" She was right. Irene knew she was right in the specific way. You know something when it has been said out loud after you have been circling it in your own head for a week. She said, "I'm going to call the name the librarian gave me." She called the name on Monday. The name was a man named Philip Scarano who ran an appraisal and authentication practice out of Scranton, and who came, when she called him and described what she had, with a focused attention that she recognized as the specific quality of someone who has just been told something that has interrupted whatever else they had planned for Tuesday. He arrived Tuesday afternoon in a coat that had seen a lot of field work and with 2 cases of equipment and the careful manner of someone who has learned to manage their own excitement in professional settings, because the excitement can lead to imprecision and the imprecision can lead to errors that cannot be undone. He went down into the cellar. He was down there for 3 hours. Irene sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and waited the way she had waited for the plumber and the gas company, with the patient attention of someone who understands that other people's work requires the room to be done properly, and that hovering is a form of interference. When Philip Scarano came up from the cellar, he sat down at the kitchen table, and he set his notebook in front of him, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who has been in this profession for 30 years and does not often have to recalibrate his expectations mid-assessment. He said, "I want to be careful about what I tell you today, because there is a great deal here that requires further examination before I can give you anything I would stake my professional reputation on. I want you to understand that what I am about to say is preliminary." She said, "I understand." He said, "The jewelry is old. The craftsmanship and the style are consistent with Southern Italian goldsmithing of the late 19th century, the period between roughly 1870 and 1910. The stones in the necklace and the brooch are rubies, natural, unheated, which is a distinction that matters considerably for valuation. The stones in the ring are sapphires, also natural. I cannot give you values today, but I can tell you that a set of this quality from this period in this condition is not ordinary. I can tell you that auction records for comparable pieces at the major houses in the past 5 years would put us in a range that I think will surprise you." Irene said, "Tell me." He named a range. She looked at him. He said, "That is preliminary and auction outcomes vary, and there are costs involved in authentication and sale. But that is a reasonable preliminary range based on what I have seen." She said, "And the paintings." He set his pen down. He said, "Mrs. Castellano, I want to be very careful here because what I am about to say is based on a visual examination in difficult lighting conditions and requires laboratory verification that I am not in a position to conduct myself. I want you to understand that I could be wrong." She said, "Tell me what you saw." He said, "I unrolled 4 canvases. The subjects are religious. The style is consistent with Southern Italian painting of the 17th and 18th centuries. The canvas, the ground preparation, the pigments as far as I can assess them visually, the craquelure, the brushwork, all of it is consistent with period work rather than later reproduction. One of the 4 has characteristics that I cannot account for if it is what I think it might be, and I'm not going to say what I think it might be because I would need proper lighting and X-ray analysis and infrared reflectography before I would say in a room with another person." He stopped. He looked at her. He said, "I would like to bring a colleague from New York, a specialist in this area. I would like to do this as soon as she is available, which I expect to be within 2 weeks. I would ask that nothing in that cellar be moved or disturbed until she has seen it. Irene said, "Nothing will be moved," he said. "I would also suggest, gently but with some emphasis, that you consult an attorney who specializes in art and cultural property law before we proceed further. What is in that cellar may have a history that is more complex than a family's private belongings, and you will want proper guidance before you make any decisions." She looked at him. She said, "Complex how?" He said, "The movement of valuable object from Italy in the early decades of the 20th century was not always straightforward. I am not suggesting anything irregular about your family situation. I am suggesting that the provenance, the documented history of these objects from their origin to this cellar, is something you will need to establish clearly for legal reasons and for your own peace of mind." She thought about Emilio Valesio coming from the Abruzzo in 1924 with his wife and his children and whatever he had brought with him. She thought about what a man of his circumstances might have carried out of Italy in 1924. She thought about the word on the box on the shelf. Promesse. Promises. She said, "There's a box in the cellar labeled promises." In Italian. I looked inside and found property deeds for 3 parcels in Dunmore, one of which is this property. I have not had the deeds examined by anyone yet. Philip Scarano wrote something in his notebook. He said, "That is important. I would include those documents in the scope of what your attorney reviews." She walked him to his car when he left. The afternoon had gone gray again, the thin clouds that northeastern Pennsylvania produces in February like a default condition, and the apple trees in the backyard were visible over the roofline, their branches the particular dark of old wood against pale sky. She stood on the porch after his car turned out of the road. She stood for a while. She thought about what Dennis had taken. She thought about the savings account and the Subaru and the house on Garfield Avenue, with the garden she had spent 10 years building. She thought about the manila envelope on Rose's kitchen counter. She thought about Patricia saying she was leaving things on the table. She thought about what she was standing in front of now. Then she went inside, and she called Gerald Boyle. She said, "I need the name of an attorney who specializes in art and cultural property law. I need one who can also look at some property deeds. And I need to understand something about what my grandmother knew and when she knew it, and whether there is anything written down about why she made the decision she made in 1987. Gerald Boyle said, "I have some things in the file that your grandmother asked me to hold for the right time. I believe the right time may be now." She said, "Can you come Thursday?" He said, "I will be there Thursday morning." She sat at the kitchen table after she hung up. The stop clock on the wall said 20 minutes past 3. She had not yet wound it or reset it. She had not wanted to until she felt settled enough to be the person responsible for its keeping. She looked at it now in the gray afternoon light, and she thought that perhaps Thursday was the day for that too, the day to set it to the correct time and hear it begin again. She took it from the wall. She turned it over in her hands. It was a plain clock, a kitchen clock, the kind that was made in the thousands in the middle of the last century, nothing valuable, nothing unusual. But it had hung on this wall since her grandmother was a young woman in this house, and it had stopped on a day in 1987 when Nonna Concetta had walked out of this kitchen for the last time, and it had been telling that stop time ever since. She found a key for it on the back. She wound it. She set the hands to the correct time. She hung it back on the wall. It began to tick. The sound was small in the quiet kitchen, regular and unremarkable, the sound of a clock doing what clocks do, marking the passage of time with the patient indifference of a mechanism that does not know what the time means, only that it is passing. But it was not indifferent to Irene. It was the sound of a house coming back to life. Gerald Boyle came Thursday morning as he had said he would, arriving in a practical car with a briefcase and the same measured manner he had shown his office. The manner of a man who has learned that the steadiness he brings to a room is itself a form of assistance in circumstances where steadiness is not always available. He sat at the kitchen table, and he opened his briefcase, and he took out a sealed envelope, and he set on the table between them. He said, "Your grandmother gave me this in the second year I represented her estate, which was 4 years ago. She said it was to be given to whoever received the property, which she already knew was you. She said I would know when the right time was. I believe the right time is now." She looked at the envelope. Her name was on it in Nonna Concetta's handwriting, which she recognized immediately, the upright, careful letters of someone who had learned to write in the formal tradition of an Italian elementary school in the 1930s, a handwriting that had not substantially changed in the decades since. She broke the seal. She unfolded the letter. It was 2 pages, written in the mix of Italian and English that Nonna Concetta had always used in private correspondence, the language moving between the two without apparent system, following the availability of the words rather than any rule. She read it slowly. Nonna Concetta had written, "My father Emilio came from Casoli in the province of Chieti in 1924. He came with what the family had, which was more than it appeared to be, because the family had been in Casoli for many generations, and some of those generations had been people of means, and the things that people of means accumulate do not always disappear when the means do. When my father left Italy, he brought what he could carry, and what he could carry he brought to Pennsylvania, and what he brought he put in the ground on this property, where he believed it would be safe." She had written, "My father told me about the cellar when I was 20 years old, and he was old and believed I was ready to know. He told me what was in it. He told me what it had come from. He told me that some of the things in the cellar had a history that was complicated, and that before anything in the cellar could be properly disposed of, that history would need to be understood. He told me that the things in the cellar belonged to our family, that they had always belonged to our family, but that the documents proving this had been lost in ways that were not unusual for families in the time and place from which we came, and that without the documents, the belonging would need to be demonstrated in other ways." She had written, "I did not open the cellar after your grandfather died because I was afraid, not of the things in the cellar, of the people around me. Your grandfather was the person I trusted to help me understand what to do, and when he was gone, I did not trust anyone else with this, and I was not strong enough to do it alone. I sealed the door, and I kept the key, and I waited for the right person." She had written, "I've been watching you for a long time, Irene. I watched you when you were young, and I watched you through your marriage, and I watched you when things in your marriage were not what they should have been, and I watched you hold yourself together with the particular stubbornness that our family carries, the stubbornness that my father had, the stubbornness that does not give up on things because they are difficult." She had written, "You are the right person. You are the right person not because your life has been easy, it has not, but because you have not let the hard things make you small. What is in that cellar has waited a long time. It can wait a little longer while you learn what you have and what to do with it. But I believe you will know. I always believe that." She had written at the bottom of the 2nd page, in Italian, "La pazienza è la forza dei forti. Patience is the strength of the strong." Irene folded the letter along its original folds. She sat on the table. She sat for a while in the kitchen with the clock ticking on the wall, and Gerald Boyle sitting quietly across from her with the understanding of a man who knows that this moment does not require anything from him except his presence. Then she said, "My grandmother was afraid for 37 years, and she did it alone." Gerald Boyle said, "She did." Irene said, "I'm not afraid." She said it without drama. The way you say things when you know they are true and do not need emphasis to be true. She picked up the letter, and she put it in the pocket of her coat, beside the 2 keys that she still carried there every day, the heavy iron key and the small worn key, the key to the outside and the key to what was inside. She said, "Tell me about the other 2 properties, the ones in the deeds." Gerald Boyle opened his briefcase again. He said, "That is the other thing I came to tell you. If you're still with this story, you already understand that what Irene found was not simply objects in a cellar. It was the evidence of a life that had been preparing for her arrival. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." Outside the window of the kitchen on Valesio Road, the February afternoon was moving toward its early close, the light going golden at the edges in the way of winter afternoons that turned briefly warm at the end, and the apple trees in the backyard caught it in their branches and held it for a moment before the dark came. The clock on the wall ticked. Irene Castellano, 61 years old, with $30 in her checking account and a suitcase of clothes and 2 boxes with everything she owned, sat at her great-grandfather's kitchen table and listened to what Gerald Boyle had come to tell her. And what Gerald Boyle had come to tell her was this: The other two properties on the deeds that she had found in the box marked Promise were not empty land. They were not undeveloped lots sitting forgotten on streets she did not know. One of them was a building on Meridian Street in Dunmore that had been leased commercially for 40 years by a series of tenants, the lease administered by the county under the terms of the probate process, the income held in an account that had been accumulating with interest since 1987 under the supervision of the court. The other was a piece of land on the eastern edge of the city, 2 acres, that bordered a parcel that had been developed in the 1990s and that the developer of that parcel had attempted, repeatedly and unsuccessfully, to acquire. Gerald Boyle said, "The commercial lease income, accumulated from 1987 to the present, amounts to a sum that I think will be meaningful to you given your current circumstances." He named the sum. She looked at him. He said, "The land on the eastern edge, based on its current assessed value and the development pressure from the adjacent parcel, has been independently valued in the past 2 years." He named that figure too. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock ticked. She said, "My grandmother had this and lived in a room at my aunt's house." Gerald Boyle said gently, "She made her choices about how to live. People do not always choose comfort when they have the option of something they consider more important." Irene thought about Nonna Concetta in the room in Scranton with the rosary on the bedside table and the window that looked onto the street. She thought about the years she had spent there, the last 7 years of a 94-year life, modest and contained, while on the other side of the mountain range an account was accumulating in her name. She thought about the Sunday in April, the last time she had held her grandmother's hand. She thought about the weight of what a person carries alone when they have decided that carrying it alone is the correct thing to do. She said she was waiting until she was sure. Gerald Boyle said, "I believe so." She said, "And she chose me." Gerald Boyle said, "She chose you." She looked at the window. The golden light in the apple trees had gone. The evening was coming, the specific early dark of February in the mountains, and the trees were silhouettes now against the last pale strip of sky above the roofline. She thought about what Dennis had taken. She thought about $30 and a borrowed car and a manila envelope with a date on it. She thought about her grandmother's hand, dry and weightless, and the words that had felt like reassurance and had been something far more specific. "I know so," Nonna Concetta had said. "There's a difference." She understood now what her grandmother had known and had been carrying and had chosen, finally, to set down. The difference was not between hope and certainty. The difference was between what you have been given by others and what has been waiting for you all along. She had been given nothing by Dennis. He had taken what she had spent 33 years building and had signed his name to the taking and had not looked at her face. But her grandmother had been watching her for 60 years with the patient attention of someone who understands that the people worth watching are the ones who do not stop. And what Nonna Concetta had seen, watching, was this: that Irene would come to Dunmore when the time was right, that she would open the cellar without being afraid, that she would ask the right questions in the right order, that she would sit at this kitchen table and hear what Gerald Boyle had to tell her, and she would not cry, and she would not celebrate, and she would do exactly what she did next, which was to set down her coffee cup and look at the man across from her and say, in the steady voice of someone who has been through the thing that was supposed to break her and has come through the other side of it and is ready now, genuinely ready for what comes next. She said, "Tell me what I need to do." The paintings were authenticated. One was attributed to a 17th-century Neapolitan master. The jewelry sold at auction in New York for amounts that settled every debt Irene carried and built a foundation beneath her feet that no one could take. The commercial property on Meridian Street became hers outright. The eastern land sold to the developer who had wanted it for 30 years. Dennis heard through Sophia what her mother had found. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Irene never mentioned him again. She planted the garden in spring, the apple trees already blooming above her, white and unhurried and entirely at peace. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.